Whitney slapped the eviction notice onto the kitchen counter and pinned it there with 2 fingers right beside the brass room key I had carried for 30 years. "You have 1 week to clear out," she said. She did not lower her voice. She wanted Owen to hear it from the stairs. I had scrubbed strangers' toilets before dawn to pay for that counter. I had knelt on motel bathroom tile until my knees split open, stripped the sheets that guests left ruined, breathed bleach until my throat burned, and pushed a housekeeping cart down hallways where people stepped past me like I was part of the wallpaper. Every dollar sealed inside the walls of this house crawled out of that cart. And this woman who had never wrung out a rag in her life slid a printed sheet of paper across my own counter and told me to vanish from it. I picked up the notice. I folded it once along the crease slowly. I did not throw it. Whitney watched my hands and waited for me to break, to beg, to grovel the way she had rehearsed in her head. She had counted my money down to the last coin. She was certain she knew the number. She had built this whole eviction on that number. She had it wrong. She had every part of it wrong, and she was about to learn why the first rule of a quiet fortune is that you never let the people closest to you count what they did not earn. My name is Ruth Callahan. I am 68 years old, and for 30 of those years I cleaned rooms out of the Riverside Lodge, a 3-story hotel off the state highway, where salesmen and truckers and families passing through slept for a night and left their mess behind. I know the particular smell of a room after checkout. I know what people become when they think no one is watching and no one will ever know their name. I mopped up the parts of humanity that get left on the floor. I did it in a gray uniform with a plastic tag over my chest that read Ruth in blue letters, and under it the single word housekeeping, and I did it while the man I married drifted out the door of our lives and never sent $1 back for the boy he left me. Let me tell you what 30 years of that does to a body and to a soul, because it matters for everything that comes after. My knees are the knees of a woman who spent decades on tile floors, and on cold mornings they still tell me the whole history. My hands learned to move fast enough to turn 16 rooms in an 8-hour shift strip. The beds remake them with corners so tight a coin would bounce. Scour the tubs, wipe the mirrors clear of whatever a stranger had breathed onto them in the night. I found things in those rooms that I will never repeat. And I found kindness too, a folded $20 bill under a pillow with a note that said thank you. A child's drawing left on the desk for whoever came next. But mostly I learned what it is to be invisible. I would be down on my hands in a doorway, scrubbing a stain out of the carpet, and a man in a good suit would step over me on his way to the elevator, without so much as a glance, the way you step over a garden hose. I was the woman who made the room look as though no one had ever been dirty in it, and the reward for doing that job perfectly was that no one ever knew I had been there at all. For a long time that hurt me. Then slowly over the years it taught me something the people who stepped over me never learned, which is that a person who can be invisible when she chooses is a person who can see everything and remember everything and be underestimated by everyone. And there is no stronger position in the world than that. The boy was Danny. I raised him alone in a 2-bedroom rental with a furnace that groaned all winter. I packed his lunches out of the day-old rack at the grocery store. I sewed the knees of his jeans until the fabric would not hold a stitch. When the lodge needed me on a holiday, and it always did, I brought him with me and set him up with a coloring book behind the front desk while I turned the rooms, and the night manager pretended not to see because he had children of his own and understood. Danny grew up learning the weight of a vacuum cleaner and the smell of industrial soap and the particular tiredness of a mother who has stood all day and still has supper to cook. I used to think that would make him grateful. I used to think a boy who watched his mother work like that would grow into a man who never took an easy dollar for granted. And I told myself the way tired women do at 2 a.m, that if I gave him enough, if I loved him hard enough, and asked for nothing, he would grow into a man who understood what love had cost. I was half right. Love had cost me everything I had. The second half of that sentence took 30 years to arrive, and it arrived on a printed notice pinned to my counter by 2 manicured fingers. 7 years ago on a Tuesday in October, I bought a lottery ticket at the gas station beside the highway on my way home from a double shift. I almost left it on the counter because the machine had smeared a gray streak across the numbers, and I could barely read them. The clerk, a young woman named Katie, who worked the register on weekends, blew on the paper and laughed and said the streak was good luck. That ticket won the largest state prize of the year. After the state took its share, I was left with a little over $12 million. I did not stand outside the gas station in a bright coat and smile for a camera. The first thing fear teaches you when a number that large lands on your kitchen table is that a fortune is not a gift. It is a loud noise that everyone within 100 miles can hear, and every person who hears it starts walking toward the sound. So I did not make a sound. Through the state lottery office, I found a lawyer named Arthur Pruitt, an old man with steady hands and a way of speaking that made silence feel like a plan instead of a lie. Arthur set the whole thing up so that I claimed the prize through a trust which the law in our state allowed, and my name never touched a public record. Then he formed a small company called Brass Key Holdings, named for the color of the key I had carried on my hip for 3 decades. And it was Brass Key Holdings, not Ruth Callahan, that bought the house on the lake. I want to be honest about the house, because the house is where everything turned. It had 5 bedrooms, a stone fireplace tall enough to stand inside, and a wall of windows that looked out over the water. I did not buy it because I wanted 5 bedrooms. I bought it because Danny and Whitney were raising Owen in a leaking apartment above a laundromat, and Owen, who was 5, then slept on a fold-out couch in the living room because Whitney had claimed the second bedroom for a home office she rarely used. I wanted my grandson to have a door he could close. I wanted my son to feel for the first time in his life that the ceiling above his head belonged to him. So I gave them the house to live in rent-free, and I told them the property was held by a company I managed for family investments. I told them the money had come from a small inheritance left to me by an aunt. I did not tell them about the ticket or the streak or the 12 million because I already knew, the way you know a storm by the smell of the air, what that number would do to the people I loved. For the first year, they treated the house as a blessing. Danny cried when I handed him the keys. "Mom," he said, "I will never forget this." Whitney hugged me harder than she ever had, and she called the house a miracle in front of her friends, and she asked my opinion about paint colors and dinner recipes. That first winter, we spent Christmas around the stone fireplace, all 4 of us, and Whitney gave me a small framed photograph she had taken of the 4 of us on the porch the day they moved in the lake right behind us, and she wrote on the back, "To the woman who gave us a home." And at the time, I believed every word of it. And I kept that photograph on my nightstand for years without once imagining that the woman who had written it would one day set an eviction notice down beside my brass key on the kitchen counter. Owen used to find me in the kitchen and tell me about his day while I peeled potatoes. On summer evenings, he sat on the back steps beside me while I watered the herbs I grew in clay pots, basil and thyme, and a stubborn rosemary that refused to die. He would ask me about the hotel, about the strangest thing anyone had ever left in a room, and I would tell him a story and he would laugh, and the light would go long and gold over the water. Those evenings were real. I want that written down before the rest of it, because the rest of it does not erase them, and because a fall only breaks your heart if there was something real at the top of it to fall from. Then the questions started the way they always do. How much had I put aside? Whether the house was paid off. What would happen to the property if I died? Did Danny have any legal claim? I answered every one of them with the same 4 words. "Everything is arranged," I said. It was the truth. Everything was arranged so carefully that no one could reach it. But those 4 words landed on Whitney like an insult because they ended the conversation without handing her a number, and Whitney needed a number the way some people need air. So she began to study me. She noticed that I still shopped the discount racks and clipped coupons out of the Sunday Circular. She noticed that I drove the same 15-year-old sedan with a cracked taillight I fixed with red tape. She noticed that I never replaced the dated kitchen cabinets, even though a house like ours could have carried a far grander renovation. One afternoon, she found me sorting coupons at the table, and she leaned against the counter with her arms crossed. "You live like you are afraid the money will run out," she said. I told her that being careful was not the same as being afraid. If you actually had it, she said you would enjoy it. I told her I enjoyed knowing it was there. She smiled the way you smile at a child who has said something quaint, and she walked away, and I understood watching her go that she had just decided I had almost nothing left. I let her keep that idea. It was the safest thing I owned. By the 3rd year, Danny had stopped asking me directly. Instead, he talked about opportunities. A friend of his wanted to start a contracting business and only needed a little startup money. Whitney's sister was going through a divorce and needed help with the lawyer. A man down the road had land for sale that would make the perfect investment if we moved quickly. Every opportunity arrived with a reason I needed to act right away, and I said no to all of them, and each no cost me something. The first time I refused Danny, he did not speak to me for 2 weeks. Then he showed up with grocery store flowers and said he understood. The second time, Whitney told me I was selfish. The third time, Danny said I had changed after the money, whatever money I still had, and I wanted to tell him that the money had not changed me at all. It had only made his expectations easy to see the way a hard rain makes the cracks in a ceiling show. Only Owen stayed the same. He was 12 now, a quiet, watchful boy who noticed things the adults around him missed. One evening when he was 10, he asked me why his parents got angry when I said no. Some people, I told him, believe that love should come with a receipt. He did not understand the sentence, but he tucked it away somewhere, the way he tucked away everything, and he remembered it. I know he remembered it because a boy who remembers that his grandmother once said such a thing is a boy who is already watching his parents and quietly keeping score. The house became a place of careful silence. Danny and Whitney lived on the upper floor, and I took the downstairs bedroom near the garden so I could be close to my herbs. We passed each other in the hallways like strangers sharing a hotel, which was a thing I understood better than most, having spent my life among strangers sharing a hotel. They began making decisions about the property without me. Whitney planted expensive ornamental shrubs along the front walk. Danny hired a crew to convert half the garage into a home gym. When I questioned the cost, Danny said the improvements would raise the value of the house. Whose value, I asked. He smiled as though I were being difficult and said ours eventually. That single word eventually was the first time I heard out loud what they had decided in private. The house was theirs. I was simply the old woman living in it until the timing was right. I removed the gym charges from the company account and told Danny the work had to stop. He accused me of humiliating him in front of the contractors. The next month, Whitney moved my dishes out of the main kitchen and into a cabinet in the laundry room, and she told me the kitchen needed a cleaner look for when she had guests. I moved my dishes back. That evening, she sent Danny down to speak for her. "Whitney just wants this to feel like our home," he said, standing in my doorway. "It is your home because I allow you to live here," I said. "It is not your property." His jaw tightened. "You always have to remind us," he said. "You always seem to forget," I said. For a few weeks after that, they were polite again, and I let myself believe the boundary had done its work. Then a man in a gray suit appeared at my breakfast table with a tablet computer and a folder, and Whitney introduced him as Doug, someone who helped families make sensible decisions before a crisis forced their hand. I asked why he was in my kitchen. Whitney said she had invited him to review my living arrangements, because she said we need to know whether you can keep maintaining a house this size. Doug turned out to be a placement consultant for a chain of senior living communities, and the folder held glossy brochures full of small, tidy rooms with grab bars in the showers and photographs of smiling gray-haired residents playing cards. I asked Doug whether he had any professional relationship with me. He said no, he had only been asked to provide general information. I told him he could go. He gathered his brochures and left. Whitney shut the door behind him, hard enough to rattle the glass. And Danny said I had been rude, and I asked Danny whether he had given Doug permission to discuss my finances. He looked at the floor and did not answer. That was the season the money stopped being an invisible blessing and became an absent person they could blame. They told themselves I had received a modest sum and lost most of it, and that story explained everything. They resented my caution, my old car, my refusal to fund their opportunities. It never once occurred to either of them that I might have kept the whole truth from them precisely because I knew to the dollar and to the day how they would behave the moment they saw the real number. 6 months before Whitney pinned the notice to my counter, 2 things happened close together. The first was a letter from Arthur Pruitt with the annual statement from the trust. The house had been bought outright with roughly $3 million of the prize. The remaining $9 million he had placed in a conservative mix of bonds and index funds. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would draw attention, and over 7 quiet years, the balance had grown at a modest, unremarkable rate. Counting the house, which was still mine because Brass Key Holdings was still mine, the whole thing was now worth just under $13 million. I read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in the drawer where I kept spare batteries and rubber bands, because there was no one in the house I trusted to see it. The second thing was that I learned Danny was in trouble. His employer, a building supply distributor where he had worked for years as a middling salesman, had cut his commission after a bad quarter. Whitney had sunk thousands of dollars into a scheme to sell overpriced home organizing systems online, and the unsold inventory now filled the half of the garage the gym had not swallowed. They were behind on their cards. I offered gently to sit down with them and help them build a plan to get out from under it. Whitney laughed at me across the kitchen island. "You mean you want to control us?" she said. I withdrew the offer. It was the last time I offered them anything they did not have to earn. 1 week later, the notice appeared. It was not a court document. It was a letter Whitney had typed herself printed on the home printer, and it informed me that the house was no longer suitable for shared living, that I would need to relocate within 7 days, and that Danny and she would be managing the property from that point forward. Manage the property from that point forward. I read that line 3 times. Then I looked at Whitney, who was watching my face with something close to hunger, and I folded the notice along its crease and thanked her. "Thank you for what she said," thrown by the calm in my voice. "For finally making your position clear," I said. She had expected an argument. She had prepared for tears, for pleading, for the satisfying spectacle of an old woman coming apart at the seams. Instead, I placed the folded notice in my apron pocket next to the brass key, and I walked past her out to the garden where the last of the season's basil was going to seed, and I stood in the cool October air and let the sound of the water settle my hands. Upstairs, I could hear Owen's footsteps stop and start on the stairs, a boy who had heard every word and did not know what to do with it. I did not go up to comfort him yet. There was something I needed to understand first, standing in my own garden, that they believed was theirs, and it was this. For 7 years, I had protected these people from a number, and my protection had taught them that I had nothing worth protecting. My silence had been a kindness. They had mistaken it for weakness. And a woman who has spent 30 years cleaning up after people who never learned her name knows the exact difference between the two. That night after the house went dark, I sat on the edge of my bed and took the brass key out of my pocket and turned it over in my fingers. Room 114. It was the key I had kept the day the Riverside Lodge finally closed and sold the building because the manager was throwing the whole rack into a dumpster, and I could not bear to see 30 years go into the trash. For 3 decades, that key had opened doors so that other people could rest. I ran my thumb over the worn number stamped into the brass and thought about how many doors I had opened in my life, and how few had ever opened for me, and how the 2 people sleeping above my head believed they had the right to shut the last one in my face. I put the key on my nightstand where I could see it. Then I lay down, and for the first time in a long while, I slept without a single dream the way you sleep when you have finally stopped pretending. Whitney believed she had a week to move me out. She did not understand that she had in fact only started a clock on herself, and that the woman she had underestimated had spent 30 years learning exactly how to strip a room down to nothing and put it back the way it was supposed to be. The morning after the notice, Whitney began the eviction, the way she did everything as a performance for an audience she assumed was on her side. I came in from the garden to find her in my downstairs bedroom with a stack of flattened cardboard boxes, pulling my books off the shelf and dropping them into a carton. She had already taken down the framed photograph of Danny at 8 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, and laid it face down on the bed. I asked her what she thought she was doing. "Helping you get a head start on the move," she said without turning around. "You will thank me when Friday comes." I set down the basket of herbs I had cut. I told her to stop. She kept working, sliding another book off the shelf, and she said the letter gave her the authority to prepare the house for the transition. I walked to the carton, lifted it out of her hands, and carried it to the far wall of the room, and I stood in front of it. Whitney straightened up and looked at me with an expression I had come to know well over 7 years, the particular disbelief of a person who has never once been told no by someone she considers beneath her. "You are being childish," she said. I told her that these were my belongings in my house, and she would not touch them again. She said the neighbors would think it was very sad, an old woman clinging to a few books. I said the neighbors could think whatever they liked. She left the room, and a moment later I heard her on the phone in the upstairs hall, her voice pitched to carry down the open stairwell, telling someone that I was making the whole thing impossible, and that if I dug in, they might never get control of the place. Control of the place. She said it plainly into a phone in a house I owned, and she did not lower her voice because it never occurred to her that the woman downstairs was worth lowering her voice for. Over the next 2 days, the 2 of them moved against me, the way water moves against a wall, patiently from several directions at once. Whitney rearranged the kitchen again, packed my dishes into a box she left by the back door, with a sticky note that said donate. I unpacked it. Danny came home from work each evening and pointedly did not speak to me. And when I passed him in the hall, he looked through me, which was a thing I had spent 30 years being looked through by strangers, and had never once expected from my own son. On the 3rd morning, I found a real estate flyer on my nightstand, a listing for a studio apartment in a senior complex across town, 40 minutes from Owen's school, with a note in Whitney's round handwriting that said, "This one has a nice view." And there was one more thing Whitney did in those first days, a thing she was proud of, a thing she believed was her trump card. She sat across from me at the kitchen island. On the second evening, folded her hands and told me that I should not fight this, because when they had moved in 7 years earlier, she had been smart enough to make me sign proper paperwork. "You signed documents, Ruth," she said, savoring my first name the way she always did when she wanted to remind me I was not her mother. She said it as though the paperwork were a wall between me and my own house. I looked at her for a long moment. It was true that they had signed something when they moved in. It was true that Whitney had been the one to push for, it had insisted on making it official, had wanted in her words at the time. Everything in writing so no one could ever say we were freeloaders. What Whitney did not know, because Whitney had never once hired her own lawyer to read a page before she signed it, was what the document actually was. She thought she had made me sign away my rights. In truth, she had signed a thing that Arthur Pruitt had drafted with great care, and she had signed it eagerly, and her signature sat at the bottom of it in blue ink. But that is getting ahead of the week. On the second evening, all I said was yes. We signed papers when you moved in, and Whitney smiled satisfied, certain she had shown me her strongest card. She had shown me nothing. She had only reminded me that the card was still in my hand. The escalation reached its first true break on the 4th day. I came home from the grocery store to find a pickup truck in the driveway, and 2 men I did not know carrying my armchair out the front door toward the curb. Whitney stood on the porch directing them a clipboard in her hand as if the clipboard made it real. She saw my car and lifted her chin. "The notice gives me the authority to manage the residence," she said before I had even shut the car door. "We are clearing the common areas. I want you to understand that I did not raise my voice." 30 years of cleaning rooms teaches you that the people who shout are the people who have already lost the argument. I walked up to the 2 men who had my chair balanced between them and were looking, I could see, increasingly unsure of the whole business, and I told them calmly that they were removing furniture from a private home without the owner's consent, and that the woman on the porch was not the owner, and that if they set my chair on that curb, they would be doing so against the wishes of the person whose name was on the deed. One of them looked at Whitney. "She's the owner," Whitney said, but her voice had climbed half a step. The man looked at me. I said, "Call your dispatcher and ask them to verify who holds title to this address before you touch anything else of mine." They set the chair down on the porch, not the curb, and they backed away from it, and Whitney's face went white with a fury she could not use, because the 2 men she had hired had just heard a note in my voice that she could not match. Then I went inside and made 2 phone calls. The first was to Loretta Briggs, who had cleaned rooms beside me at the Riverside Lodge for 19 years, who knew me better than anyone alive, and who had once carried me through the worst winter of my life on nothing but strong coffee and stubbornness. The winter Danny turned 9, I had gotten sick of fever that would not break, and I could not afford to miss a single shift, and Loretta had covered half my rooms and hers every day for 2 weeks, without ever once mentioning it. And then she had shown up at my door with a pot of soup and sat with Danny while I slept off the worst of it. That is who Loretta Briggs was. In 30 years of being invisible to 1,000 strangers, she was the one person who had always without fail seen me. So when the time came that I needed someone in a room who could look my son and his wife in the eye and tell them exactly who I was and what I had spent my life doing, there was only ever one name. I asked Loretta if she could come by Friday morning to sit in a room and witness a conversation. She did not ask why. She said she would be there, and she said, "Ruthie, whatever this is, you tell them." I said hello. The second call was to Arthur Pruitt. I told him the situation plainly, the notice, the boxes, the men, and the chair, the phone call about control of the place. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said in his slow, steady way, "Ruth, they have made a series of mistakes, and I think it is time we let them see the shape of what they signed." He said he would drive out that afternoon. Arthur arrived at 4 o'clock in a car older than mine, wearing a cardigan and carrying a worn leather folder, and he looked less like a lawyer than like somebody's grandfather come to fix a lawnmower, which is exactly why I trusted him. Whitney met him at the door and told him this was a private family matter and he should leave. Arthur said he had been retained by the owner of the property and asked very politely whether he might sit down. Danny came in from work while Arthur was setting his folder on the dining table in the sight of a strange old man at the table, and Whitney's rattled expression told Danny that something had shifted that he did not understand. Arthur laid it out without drama. He explained that the house was owned by a company and that Danny and Whitney had lived in it under an arrangement, and that no one occupying the house had the right to remove the owner's belongings, hire crews to alter the property, or represent themselves as having authority over it. Whitney stood up. "We are not tenants in this house," she said, her voice sharp. "We made this our home." Arthur did not raise his eyes from the folder. He simply turned a page and said the documents say otherwise. It was the first time in 7 years that a person from outside the family had named the truth flatly, without softening it to spare anyone's feelings, and the room went very quiet. Danny sat down slowly in a chair, the way a man sits when the floor he has been standing on turns out to be a picture of a floor. "What documents?" he said. Arthur closed the folder. He looked at Danny not unkindly and he said, "Ask your mother where she keeps the copy she gave you the day you moved in." Then he stood, thanked me, and let himself out, and the two of them sat at the table in the wreckage of their certainty, and neither of them went to look for the folder, because some part of both of them had already begun to be afraid of what it would say. That night I heard them arguing upstairs. Not the loud, satisfying kind of argument, but the low, frightened kind. The kind married people have when the ground has moved and each of them is quietly asking whether the other one has ruined them. I did not gloat. I sat in my armchair, the one that had almost gone to the curb, and I listened to the water outside the window, and I thought about how strange it was that the truth had been sitting in a folder in this house for 7 years, and that all that time they had built a whole life on top of it, without ever once opening it to see what held the life up. The next morning was Wednesday, and Owen did not go to school. He told his parents he felt sick, and Whitney, distracted, let him stay home. But he was not sick. He came down to my room while Danny was at work, and Whitney was out, and he sat on the end of my bed the way he had sat on the back steps 100 summer evenings, and he asked me if it was true that we were losing the house. I told him no one was losing the house. His parents were choosing to leave it because they did not want to follow the rules of the person who owned it. He turned that over. Then he asked in a small voice if I was broke. His mother had told him I was broke. She had told him that they were only asking me to move somewhere smaller because they were protecting me from the embarrassment of a house I could no longer afford. I almost laughed, but he was frightened, so I did not. "No, Owen," I said. "I am not broke." "Then why does Mom say you spent it all?" he said. "Because she does not know what I still have," I said, "and she is guessing, and people who guess in the dark usually guess the thing that lets them do what they already wanted to do." He did not fully understand, but he nodded because he was a boy who trusted me more than he trusted the story the adults kept telling him. And then he did a thing that I did not expect, a thing that would matter more than any document Arthur Pruitt owned. He took out his phone. "Grandma," he said, and his hand was shaking, "I have to show you something, and I think I did something wrong." A few nights earlier, he told me he had been sitting on the stairs, not spying, just sitting the way lonely children sit on stairs in unhappy houses. And his mother had been on the phone in the hall above him, and he had gotten scared, and without really deciding to, he had started recording on his phone because a part of him wanted a grown-up somewhere to know what he was hearing. He had never played it for anyone. He had almost deleted it. But he had kept it the way I had kept a brass key I had no use for, because throwing it away felt like agreeing that it had never happened. He held the phone out to me, and his thumb hovered over the screen, and he said, "Is it wrong that I kept it?" And I took his small hand in both of mine, and I said, "No, sweetheart. It is not wrong to remember the truth. Hold on to it. Do not play it for anyone else. But do not throw it away." I did not listen to it then. I did not need to. The fact that my grandson had been so frightened by his own mother that he recorded her voice on the stairs told me everything I needed to know about the house they wanted to build once I was gone. I put my arm around him, and we sat there together in the quiet, a 12-year-old boy and a 68-year-old woman, the only two people in that house of 5 bedrooms who were not pretending. That afternoon, Whitney sent a message to the whole extended family, my sister Danny's cousins and aunt in Ohio. She wrote that I was going through a period of financial confusion and possibly some cognitive decline, and that everyone should avoid discussing money or property with me until the situation was resolved for my own protection. My sister forwarded it to me before I even knew it had been sent. "Ruth," she wrote, "I believe you. I have always believed you, but I think you should stop protecting people who are willing to call you confused in front of the whole family." She was right. I had spent 7 years spending my silence like it was free. It was not free. It had cost me my grandson's peace and my own dignity, and I was done paying. I typed a single sentence into the family group and sent it. "I am not confused," I wrote. "I own the house on the lake, and I am fully aware of every account that bears my name." I attached nothing. No statement, no proof, no explanation. And the absence of proof made the sentence stronger than any document could have, because a woman who is bluffing shows her cards, and a woman who is telling the truth does not have to. The group went silent for almost an hour. Then Whitney wrote that I was being cruel and paranoid, And a cousin asked what on earth was going on, and Danny wrote, "Please everyone stop taking sides." But the sentence sat there above all their replies, calm and unretracted, and everyone in that family read it and understood in the particular way that families understand things they will never say out loud, that the old woman they had all quietly written off might not be who they had decided she was. Now I began to prepare in earnest, and I did it the way I had cleaned rooms for 30 years methodically from the far corner, inward missing nothing. I made 3 calls. The first was to Loretta Briggs to confirm Friday and to ask her to bring the old name tag, the one that read Ruth in Housekeeping, that she had saved from the day the lodge closed because she had saved one too, and I wanted it on the table. The second was to Arthur Pruitt. I asked him to draft 2 documents. The first was a proper lease at full market rent with no path to ownership and no permission to alter the property. An actual tenancy I would offer Danny and Whitney if they chose to stay and behave like adults. The second was the formal notice drawn up correctly this time, revoking the occupancy arrangement and giving them 30 days to leave, because I would do this inside the law all the way, no matter how far outside it they had wandered. Arthur asked me a careful question. "Ruth," he said, "do you want to force them out or do you want to give them a door?" I thought about it. "I want to give them a door," I said, "and I want them to be the ones who decide whether to walk through it." The third call was to the bank that held the trust accounts to request a certified statement of the current balance printed on their letterhead, stamped and dated, to be ready by Friday. Not because I needed the number to win an argument. I had already won the argument the moment I stopped being afraid. I needed the number for a different reason. For 7 years, Danny and Whitney had lived inside a story they invented about that number, and the story had rotted everything it touched. I did not want to win. I wanted to end the story once completely in a room where no one could reshape it afterward, so that whatever came next would at least be built on something true. While I waited for Friday, the pressure I had been carrying alone began at last to reach the other side of the house. On Thursday afternoon, Danny's employer called my cell phone. A woman from the Human Resources Office, apologetic, said she was confirming details for a relocation and retention package they were putting together for Danny, and that his file listed a family-owned property at my address as an asset, and could she confirm the home was available as collateral. I asked her very evenly to remove my address and my personal information from Danny's file because the property did not belong to Danny and never had. She apologized again and said of course, and the call lasted less than 3 minutes, and when it ended I sat for a while with the phone in my lap. My son had described my house to his employer as a family asset. He had said it no doubt in some hopeful conversation about his future, the way you say a thing you wish were true until you half believe it. But words become documents when a person needs them to justify a decision, and now the words were in a file with my address attached, and a stranger in an office somewhere had almost made them real. When Danny came home, I told him about the call. I watched the color leave his face. "I never gave them your number," he said. "You gave them the address," I said, "and you described this house as a family asset, and a woman in an office nearly turned that description into a lien." He put his face in his hands. For the first time all week, I saw that the fear had begun to reach him from the other side. Not the fear of losing the house, but the older, deeper fear of a man who is beginning to see the shape of what he has done. I did not comfort him. Comfort would have turned the moment into another rescue, and rescuing Danny was the habit that had brought us here. He needed this once to sit inside the thing he had helped build. So I left him at the kitchen table with his face in his hands, and I went to bed, and I let him sit with it, because that was the last gift I had left to give him, and it did not feel like a gift, and it was. Thursday night, near midnight, Danny knocked on my door. He came in alone and sat in the chair by the window and did not look at me for a long time. "Mom," he finally said, "can we fix this before Friday?" I asked him what he meant by fix. He said Whitney had moved too fast, that things had gotten out of hand, that he still loved me. And then he said the thing that told me exactly where he still stood. He said they would be willing to let me keep the downstairs room, the small one near the garden, if I would stop making the ownership question public, if I would let the family handle it quietly. I looked at my son, 40 years old, sitting in the chair where his wife had almost boxed up his childhood photograph, and I said, "You are offering me 1 bedroom in my own house." "I am trying to hold the family together," he said. "You are trying to hold the house together," I said. He denied it. So I asked him the only question that mattered. "Danny," I said, "do you believe I spent the money?" He hesitated, and the hesitation was the answer, but he made himself say it anyway. "I think there is not much left," he said. Why, I asked. And he listed it all: the discount groceries, the old car, the cabinets I never replaced, the way I supported people, and then stopped: the way I never spent like a person with real money. And I said quietly, "Perhaps I do not spend like a person who is trying to convince you she has money." His jaw tightened the same way it had tightened at 8 years old when I caught him in a lie he was not ready to give up. I told him that Friday's meeting would happen in the dining room. Whitney could come. Owen could come if he wanted. Loretta would be there, and so would Arthur. "Why a meeting?" he said. "Because you have told different stories to different people," I said. "And I am going to tell one story once, and after that there will be nothing left to reshape." He asked me, almost pleading, to go easy on Whitney. And in that request I finally understood the whole architecture of my son. He had spent 7 years believing that protecting Whitney and protecting his marriage were the same act, and he had let her speak for him and act for him and evict his own mother for him, because standing between the 2 women in his life was harder than sacrificing one of them, and he had chosen to sacrifice the one who would forgive him. "I did not create the truth, Danny," I said. "I only stopped carrying it for you." He left my room without another word, and I heard him climb the stairs slowly, one at a time, like a man carrying something heavy up out of a place he had lived in for years without ever seeing the bottom. Friday came in gray and wet, with a cold rain against the windows that turned the lake the color of slate. I got up early before the house woke, and I walked through every room, and I let myself remember. Not the false memories, not a baby brought home to a house I had only owned for 7 years, but the true ones. Owen's first steps down the garden path when he was small enough to fit in the crook of my arm. The morning Whitney arrived with her suitcase and stood in the doorway and called the house a miracle, and meant it before the number got into her, the way rot gets into wood. Danny crying over a set of keys. Those things had happened. The rain did not wash them away, and neither did the notice folded in my apron pocket. I had spent years trying to forget the bad parts the way tired women do, and I understood now that forgetting the bad parts had never once protected the good ones. It had only let the bad parts grow quietly in the dark until they filled every room in a 5-bedroom house. I dressed carefully, not in anything grand, in a plain gray dress, because gray was the color I had worn to work for 30 years, and I was not ashamed of it. I put 2 envelopes in my handbag, the certified statement and the folder from Arthur and I, set the brass key to room 114 on top of them, and I closed the bag. Loretta arrived first, a little after 8, shaking the rain off a bright yellow slicker and stamping her feet on the mat, and she took one look at me and put her arms around me and held on, and neither of us said anything, because 19 years of stripping beds beside each other had taught us that some things do not need words. She had brought her name tag, and I took mine out of my handbag, and we set them side by side on the sideboard, 2 little plastic rectangles that had spent a working life over our hearts. Ruth, and in the same blue letters, Loretta, and under each of them the same single word. Whitney came downstairs at 8:30, dressed for a fight in a navy blazer, carrying a folder of her own, and she stopped when she saw Loretta, and her lip curled, because she had spent 7 years being admired as the lady of a beautiful house. And here was a woman in a yellow rain slicker with a housekeeping tag sitting in her dining room, as though she belonged there. "Who is this?" Whitney said. "This is my friend," I said. "She is here because I asked her to be." Arthur arrived at 9, and Danny came down a few minutes later, and he had not slept. I could see it in his face, and Owen appeared last in the doorway, uncertain whether he was allowed. I told him he could sit by me. He came and sat, and Loretta reached over and squeezed his shoulder, and something in the boy's chest unlocked a little, because a child in an unhappy house can always tell when a kind adult has entered the room. Whitney set her folder on the table and folded her hands on top of it. "This is absurd," she said. "I do not know why any of these people are here." I poured coffee. My hand was steady. "You gave me 1 week to move out," I said. "This is the 7th day." She said she had expected me to be reasonable about all of this. "I am being precise," I said. And then I let Arthur begin, because I wanted the truth to come first from the law in a flat old voice that could not be argued with before it came from me. Arthur opened his worn leather folder and laid the documents on the table one at a time, squaring their edges, taking his time. He explained in plain language that the house was owned by a company called Brass Key Holdings, that the sole owner of that company was Ruth Callahan, and that Danny and Whitney had occupied the house for 7 years under a specific arrangement, the terms of which they had signed the day they moved in. Whitney's chin came up. "We signed a lease," she said, "and a lease gives us rights." Arthur looked at her for a moment over his glasses. "It is not a lease," he said. He slid a single page across the table so that it faced her. It is a revocable occupancy license, he said, which is a permission to live in a property owned by someone else, revocable by the owner, granting no equity, no tenancy, and no claim of any kind on the house. He touched the bottom of the page with one finger. And this, he said, is your signature. I watched Whitney's face as she read it. I watched the moment the words stopped being a wall she had built and became a wall she had walked into. She had pushed for that document 7 years ago. She had insisted on it, wanting everything in writing, certain that a signed paper would make her position unassailable, and she had been so certain of her own cleverness that she had never once hired anyone to read it to her. She had signed away the very thing she thought she was securing. This is not what we signed, she said, but her voice had gone thin. It is exactly what you signed, I said. You just never read it. Danny leaned over and looked at the page at his own signature beside his wife's, and he made a small sound and sat back. Then Whitney did what people like Whitney always do at the edge of a cliff. She reached for the thing she thought was still solid ground. Fine, she said, and her voice climbed fine, but it does not matter because we have equity in this house now. We have improvements. We have a loan against it. We are not just going to walk away from an investment. And Arthur, without any change in his expression, took out a second document. Ah, he said. Yes, about the loan. He explained that a lender had some weeks earlier sent a routine ownership verification to the record holder of the property, which was Brass Key Holdings, which was Ruth, because someone had submitted an application for a large line of credit and represented the house on the lake as a family asset available as collateral. Whitney went very still. The application, Arthur said, has been declined and flagged because the applicant did not own the property she pledged, and pledging an asset you do not own on a credit application is not a small thing. He set the lender's letter on the table. So there is no equity, he said gently, and there is no loan against the house because the house was never yours to borrow against. What there is a false statement on a credit application with your name on it. The room was silent except for the rain. Danny turned to his wife slowly. You applied for a loan against the house, he said. His voice was not angry. It was worse than angry. It was the voice of a man discovering that the person beside him has been walking them both toward a cliff in the dark. Whitney did not answer him. She was staring at the two documents in front of her, the license she had signed and the loan she had lied on, and I watched her understand for the first time that every clever thing she had done to seize this house had been a rope she was tying around her own hands. She rallied one last time. She turned on me. This is why you are impossible, she said, her voice shaking now with real fury. You hide everything. You sneak around with lawyers and companies and secret accounts. You made us look like fools. We were trying to take care of you. And I understood that this was the moment I had prepared for with a certified statement in an envelope in my handbag. So I reached in and I took out the first envelope and I placed it in the center of the table and I did not open it. This, I said, is the statement you have all been waiting for. The money you decided I spent. Whitney's eyes fixed on the envelope. Danny whispered my name. I told you I did not want to discuss it. I said I did not. Whitney had discussed it for me for 7 years to anyone who would listen. So now once I said I will tell you. And I opened the envelope and I took out the certified statement and I held it and I told them the truth slowly so that none of it could be misremembered later. 7 years ago I said I won the lottery. The prize after taxes was a little over $12 million. I claimed it through a trust so that my name would never be in a newspaper, and I put it where no one could see it. And I told you an aunt had left me a small inheritance because I already knew what the real number would do to this family, and I was right. About $3 million of it bought this house, which is why the house is mine and always has been. The rest I invested carefully, the way a woman who spent 30 years cleaning rooms invests money, which is to say slowly and without a single wild bet. And I set the statement flat on the table so they could see the letterhead and the stamp, though I did not slide it toward them because they did not need to hold it to understand it. The balance of the trust counting this house is just under $13 million. Danny stared at the number. He had gone the color of paper. You still have all of it, he said. More than I had when you moved in, I said. And I never spent it on the things you wanted, not because I had lost it, but because I was watching what wanting it was doing to you. Whitney reached for the statement and I drew it back calmly out of her reach. You do not need to touch it, I said. You only need to stop telling people it is gone. Whitney began to cry then, and I want to be honest about the crying because it was not grief and it was not shame. It was the specific weeping of a person who has just watched a fortune she believed she was one step from controlling turn out to be real and enormous and entirely permanently out of her hands. She said through the tears that the money had made me suspicious and cold, that they had only ever tried to protect a lonely old woman who could not manage on her own. And I placed the second envelope on the table beside the first, and I said, "This explains what you were protecting me from." Inside were copies of everything, the deed, the trust, the corrected notice, and one page on top that I had written myself addressed to Danny. I did not make him read it aloud. I told him what it said. It said that if the two of them left the house peacefully within the 30 days the law allowed, I would pay 6 months of rent on a new place for them, and I would cover Owen's school transportation and his fees for the coming year, so that the child at least would not pay for what his parents had done. And it said that if they continued, if they threatened me or removed my belongings or claimed the house was theirs, every dollar of that help would end that same day. Danny looked up from the page. "You are still going to help us," he said, and his voice cracked on the word help. "I am going to help Owen," I said, "and I am giving the two of you one chance to behave like adults instead of like people waiting for someone to die." Whitney snatched the page out of his hands and read it and let it drop. "We do not need your charity," she said. "Then you may decline it," I said. And her tears stopped all at once, the way a faucet stops, because a woman who is truly grieving does not turn it off the instant the offer on the table stops being large enough. She had never wanted a fair arrangement. She had wanted the house and access to the number, and a bridge across one hard month was an insult to a woman who had planned to own the whole shore. Then Danny asked the question he had been circling all week, the only honest question he had left. "What happens to us now?" he said. And I answered him plainly, because plain was all I had left to give. "You move out within 30 days. You stop telling anyone you own this house. You do not ask me for money or property or the contents of my accounts ever again. You may see Owen here whenever he wants to come. And you may see me," I said, looking at my son, "whenever you can come to me without a demand in your hand." Whitney said I was destroying the family. "No," I said. "I am taking money out of the place where a family is supposed to be." It was the truest thing I said all morning, and it was the thing she understood least, and Loretta across the table reached over and quietly took my hand, and Owen leaned his head against my arm, and Arthur closed his folder, and outside the rain kept coming down on the lake that I owned in the house that I owned at the table, where at last there was nothing left to reshape. The meeting did not end in shouting. It ended the way real endings do in logistics. A move-out date. A lease offer declined. 2 envelopes, one accepted and one refused. Loretta had brought a paper bag of cinnamon rolls from the bakery near her apartment, and she opened it in the middle of that wreckage and offered one to Owen, and the boy took it in both hands, the way a child takes the one kind thing in a hard morning, and he ate it. And for a moment the only sound in the room was a 12-year-old boy quietly eating a cinnamon roll, and it was, I think, the most human thing that had happened in that house in a very long time. But Whitney was not finished. People like Whitney are never finished until they have played every scene to the last row of the theater. That evening, as the rain finally thinned to a mist, she went out onto the front porch and waited until a neighbor across the street came out to check her mailbox, and then Whitney raised her voice into the wet air and began to perform. "She is throwing us out." Whitney called loud enough to carry. "After everything we did for her, she is choosing money over her own family. She has always been selfish. She pretended to be generous just to snatch it all back the moment we needed her." Danny stood in the doorway behind her, frozen, unable to stop her, and unwilling to join her, which was the position he had occupied his entire marriage. I came to the door and stepped out onto the porch, and I did not shout because I have never needed to shout. "You are welcome to leave quietly," I said to Whitney in a voice pitched only to carry as far as the neighbor, and no farther. "You are not welcome to rewrite the reason." And then the neighbor, an older woman named Sylvia, who had lived across the road for 20 years and had watched this family come and go, called out across the wet street in a puzzled, genuine voice, "I always thought this house belonged to your family, dear." And Whitney turned toward her, and her mouth opened and nothing came out. For 7 years she had stood on that porch as the lady of the house on the lake admired, envied the woman who had married up into 5 bedrooms and a view of the water. And in one honest sentence from a neighbor holding her mail, that whole invented figure simply dissolved in front of the only audience Whitney had ever really been performing for. She went inside. She did not come back out. And Sylvia looked at me for a long moment and looked at the door Whitney had disappeared through, and understood the way neighbors always eventually understand who in that house had built it and who had only been asking to be let in. Late that night, Danny came down to the dining room where I was sitting alone with a cup of tea. He sat across from me, and he did not perform, and he did not plead. He told me the truth for the first time in years. He said he had let Whitney speak for him because he had been afraid of losing his marriage. And then he made himself say the harder part. He said he had also been afraid of losing the house, and that somewhere in the last few years the two fears had gotten tangled together until he could not tell them apart. I kept telling myself he said that you would never actually let us fall, that you would always catch us. And that belief, Mom, made me lazy, and it made me cruel, and I did not even see it happening. I told him that was the most honest thing he had said in 7 years. He asked if we could fix it. I told him that fixing it was not a thing you said, it was a thing you did over years, and that if he wanted a relationship with me, it would come with conditions, not promises. He would pay his own debts. He would tell his employer the truth about the address. He would sit down with his son and explain in words a 12-year-old could carry that adults sometimes make bad choices and that when they do, it is not the child's job to hold the weight of it. He said he would try. I did not call it a promise. I called it a condition. There is a difference, and by then he had learned it. Danny and Whitney moved out 30 days later. They rented a smaller house on the other side of town, an ordinary house on an ordinary street, and Whitney complained that the neighborhood was beneath them. Danny took a second job on weekends for the better part of a year to dig out from under the cards and the unsold inventory. The garage full of home organizing systems went out in a clearance sale at a loss. The gym equipment was sold. None of these were tragedies. They were simply the ordinary arithmetic of people who had spent money they did not have on the assumption that someone else would always cover the difference, catching up at last with the truth of what they earned. I did not enjoy watching it. But I did not step in to soften it either, because softening it was the very habit that had nearly cost me my home and my grandson's peace, and I was finished practicing it. The morning after they were gone, I woke in a house that was completely silent, and for the first 2 weeks, that silence frightened me. I had spent 30 years surrounded by the noise of other people's lives, and then 7 years listening for footsteps on the stairs, and now there was nothing but the water against the shore. Then slowly the silence stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like room. I moved my bedroom upstairs into the big room with the wall of windows, and I painted the walls a pale green, the green of new basil. I moved my dishes back into the main kitchen and left them there. I planted herbs in the beds by the back steps where Owen and I used to sit, and I opened every window in the house on the first warm evening and let the air move through all 5 bedrooms, and no one adjusted the thermostat, and no one moved my dishes, and no one told me which room was now theirs. Owen came every Saturday. He brought his homework and his comic books and the questions he did not want to ask at home, and I never once used him as a messenger between his parents and me. I told him more than once that his parents' choices were not his to carry. He asked me one Saturday whether his parents were poor now. They are learning to live on what they earn, I said. Is that bad? He asked. It can be one of the healthiest things that ever happens to a person, I said, though it rarely feels that way while it is happening. He thought about that the way he thought about everything, and then he went back to his comic book, and I went back to the stove, and the ordinary Saturday afternoon closed over us like calm water. Danny visited once a week at first. Early on, he apologized for believing I had spent the money, and then he said a thing that was ugly and honest, which is the only kind of honesty worth anything. He said that the idea of my fortune disappearing had actually comforted him over the years because if the money was gone, then he did not have to feel guilty about how much he had wanted it. That was the truth underneath all of it, and it cost him something to say it out loud. I told him that honesty was the beginning of a thing, not the end of it, and that the end was still years of ordinary days away, and that we would only get there one Saturday at a time. Whitney never apologized. The one time she spoke to me about it, she said I had made her look like a fool by proving I still had money, as though her humiliation were a thing I had done to her, rather than a thing she had built for herself, brick by brick out of her own certainty. I told her that the balance of my accounts had never once been her dignity, and that she had confused the two, and that I could not fix that confusion for her. She did not understand me. I stopped trying to make her. 6 months after the meeting at the dining table, I did a thing I had been turning over for a long time. I sold the house on the lake. I sold it through Brass Key Holdings to a nonprofit housing group at a price above the market, and I used the proceeds to establish a fund which I named the Brass Key Fund to provide safe housing for older women who had been pushed out of their homes by the very families they had spent their lives supporting. The house that had been a cage of quiet tension became in the end a set of small, safe apartments for women who had run out of doors. And I cannot tell you what it did to me the first time I stood in that building and watched a woman my age set her single suitcase down in a room that no one could ever tell her to leave. Her name was Frances, and she had raised 4 children and buried a husband and been informed by her eldest daughter that the family home would be sold, and that a shared room in a facility 3 states away had already been arranged for her, without anyone thinking to ask her opinion of it. When she signed the papers for her own apartment in the old lake house, her hand shook the way Owen's had shaken when he showed me the recording, and she looked at me and asked very quietly whether it was truly hers, whether anyone could put her out of it, and I told her that no one on this earth could put her out of that room, and she sat down on the edge of the bare mattress and wept. And I understood that I had finally found the one thing worth doing with a fortune that had nearly cost me my own family. Every woman who moved into that house had once been someone who cleaned or cooked or nursed or raised, and had been stepped over on the way to the elevator by the very people she had spent her life serving. I had been invisible for 30 years so that strangers could rest in clean rooms. Now I was making clean rooms where women like me could rest and never be invisible again. I moved into a smaller cottage further along the same shore. 2 bedrooms, a sunroom where I could grow herbs all winter, and a porch where I could hear the water at night. On my first evening there, I walked through every room and opened every window, and I stood in the middle of the empty sunroom, and I understood that I had spent $12 million over 7 years to buy exactly one thing, and that the thing was not the house or the view or the fund, though I was proud of the fund. The thing I had bought was a life with fewer people in it, and more truth, and it had been worth every dollar, and it would have been worth 10 times as much. I did the things I had never let myself do. I took a train across the country and watched the land change through the window for 3 days. I tracked down Katie, the young woman who had blown on my smeared ticket at the gas station and told me the streak was good luck, and I found her working the same register older, now tired in the way I had once been tired, and I sat with her on her break and thanked her, and we became improbably friends. She was the kind of friend who never once asked what she might inherit. She asked whether I had eaten lunch. That single distinction between the people who ask what you have and the people who ask whether you have eaten told me everything I had needed to learn and had taken 68 years to understand. I joined a garden club. I took up painting badly, and every river I painted came out looking a little like the one outside my window, and I kept them all. One year, almost to the day after Whitney pinned the notice to my counter, Danny drove out to the cottage with Owen, and he was carrying a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in a dish towel, was the brass key to room 114. I had left it behind, I realized, in the move on the nightstand of the big green bedroom, and Owen had found it and kept it, and now Danny was bringing it back. Owen said he thought I would want it. He said he had kept it safe all year. I took the key out of the box and turned it over in my fingers, the worn number the color that had given a company, and then a fund its name, and I hung it on a nail by the sunroom window where it caught the light off the water. Danny watched me do it. He said Whitney still believed even now that I should have simply given them the house since I had more than enough. I asked him what he believed. He looked out at the lake for a long moment. I believe he said slowly that enough is not a number. I think it is knowing what belongs to you, and knowing what you are willing to give, and knowing that those are not the same thing. It was the first time in his whole life that my son sounded like a man who could build something instead of a man waiting to inherit it. There was no grand reunion. Whitney did not come to dinner that night, and there was no scene in which the family was made whole again, with tears and embraces, because the old version of us had been built entirely on my silence and their assumptions, and a thing built on those materials cannot be honestly repaired. But something smaller began, and small honest things last longer than grand dishonest ones. Danny stopped asking about the accounts. He paid his own rent. He brought Owen to the garden club summer fair and bought a jar of my homemade jam and paid full price for it without asking for a discount, which does not sound like much and was in fact everything. Sometimes progress is so quiet, you could miss it if you were not the kind of woman who had spent 30 years noticing exactly how a room had changed while no one was watching. My life did not become meaningful because I had $13 million. I want that understood because it is the whole point. And it is a thing I would tell any woman who found herself standing where I stood with a printed notice pinned to her own counter by a hand that never earned the counter. The money gave me options. It did not give me a life. My life became meaningful the day I stopped letting money decide who was allowed to love me, and the day I understood that a boundary is not the opposite of love, but the shape love takes once it stops apologizing for existing. The number gave me choices. My boundaries gave those choices a direction. I still shop the discount racks. I still drive an old car, a newer old car now, but still old, and I still fix the taillight with red tape because it makes me laugh. I still keep the gray dress in my closet and the 2 name tags, mine and Loretta's, in a drawer in the sunroom. But now when I spend money, I spend it in the open with both hands and a glad heart. I put a new roof on the cottage. I bought Owen a telescope, and on clear nights he sets it up on my porch and shows me the rings of Saturn and names the craters on the moon. And I let him teach me, because there is nothing in this world sweeter than being taught by a child you helped raise. I paid the first month's rent on 3 apartments for 3 women who had been told by the people who should have loved them most that they were too old to begin again. And no one in my life mistakes my generosity for surrender anymore, because they have seen once plainly the difference between the two. 1 week after Whitney told me to clear out my son, believed the money was gone and the house was his. 1 year later, the money was safe. The house was sheltering women who had nowhere else to go, and the only member of my family still trying to earn his place was the one who had once simply demanded it. That was not the ending I imagined the night I almost left a smeared lottery ticket on a gas station counter. It was a better one. Sudden money can pull the greed out of the people you love and lay it on the table where everyone can see it. But a boundary held steady in a cold room while your own son watches pulls the love out too and shows you at last which of the two you were surrounded by all along. You are allowed to protect what you built. You never have to prove your love by handing over your home, your money, or your name. And a woman who spent 30 years opening doors for strangers has every right in the end to decide for herself which door she walks through and who she holds it open for and who she quietly finally lets it close behind.